Hey everybody, so today's video has been a long time coming, but obviously people know, although apparently I still encounter people who this is news to them. I'm Christian, and obviously that carries with it a whole load of questions like why? Well, why believe in God? Why Christianity and not any other religion? And those are all questions worth addressing, and to an extent I've kind of spoken around those topics, which I actually think is the best way to talk about them. But obviously another issue is the implications of that with regards to my generally progressive views, and especially progressive views on the rights of women and also same-sex attracted individuals. Now, the whole women thing is going to be, I don't know when that's coming. It will come at some point. Suffice it to say, I already have thoughts on that. These are issues that I thought about ages ago. However, for whatever reason, I felt like the issue of why I'm a gay affirming Christian was worth doing an in-depth exploration of first. And the first point I want to make is that I take the Bible seriously. And I think that point has been made quite clearly from just looking at my previous videos where I've spoken about the Bible. I'm not just some idiot who's going to throw the Bible out as if the entire basis for Christianity isn't the text of the Bible. But I do admit, of course, that I am going against the plain reading of the text. Of course, the plain reading of the text, as if it says that being gay is an abomination or whatever else, that's saying what it's saying. It's worth stressing, I've never said, though, that you can't go against the plain reading of the text. My position, first of all, obviously, I've criticized Islam, arguing that a plain reading of the text is actually quite objectionable morally. But my criticism there has always been not only that the plain reading of the text is objectionable, but I don't think there's any other valid reading of the text. Whereas my take here is that I do think there are other ways of reading this text which are actually quite valid. So this isn't going to be a video where I just go, the Bible, that's a load of nonsense, and just, throw out whatever I, don't like, act as if, and of course, what I've never done and what I never will do is act as if interpretation is just a complete free-for-all. That is a point I've tried to make very clear in my videos before. Interpretation is important. You do need to interpret things, and it does need to be stressed that sometimes the plain reading of a text is very obviously not the correct thing to do. If I write that it's raining cats and dogs, which is obviously an expression, I don't know if that's an expression in all different dialects of English, but certainly in British English it means, raining very heavily. If I say it's raining cats and dogs, interpreting the plain reading of that text is not the right move. Rather, you need to interpret it with a mind towards context and all that kind of stuff. My attitude has been not only is interpretation valid, but it's often necessary. And I have a, quite honest appreciation for the fact that sometimes interpretation is something we need to do. But what I'm not going to do is the dishonest and kind of ignorant attitude, which I hate to say is very common with a lot of atheists, of seeming to think that interpretation is just a meaningless thing that you throw out to get rid of any verses you don't like. That's never been my attitude. I take all religious texts seriously, in that I actually think if you're going to claim to be a religious person, if you're going to claim to be a Muslim, if you're going to claim to be whatever religion, you need to take the implications of that seriously. And if there is something in your religious text or religious canon that you object to, you either need to say, well, okay, in that case, I just can't belong to this religion, or you need to come up with some kind of explanation. I also want to say, it doesn't have to be, in each individual case, the most logical and rational explanation, but at least viewing the religion holistically, it should be an interpretation that can slot into it. And yeah, certainly I'm not just going to dismiss problematic texts, but I am going to try and bring them into I actually think maybe even slightly more holistically consistent view of biblical morality. So the first question is, why should we want to interpret the Bible differently? Because again, this will show how seriously I take interpreting the Bible. It's not enough, as far as I'm concerned, to just be like, well, we can come up with an alternative explanation. What we need is some reason why having an alternative explanation could make the Bible more theologically consistent. Obviously, if you've seen my video talking about interpretation of Genesis, I make a big deal out of this, showing how actually we're being more theologically consistent by interpreting Genesis figuratively. So is there any way that interpreting the Bible to not be saying that homosexual relationships are necessarily immoral is actually more theologically consistent, or in some reason, when we take the Bible and the Christian religion holistically, we should want to interpret these texts a different way, not just because we don't like them, but because there's actually an active or positive reason in the text to do so. And the first point I want to make is that, well, to be honest, it's kind of the only point I want to make, but I'm going to elaborate on the point, is that there's an old Jim Jeffries joke. I say it's old. Jim Jeffries isn't that old, but it's a joke which I saw. I mean, for context, it's a joke I saw back when I was an atheist. And he says, the Bible should only be one page. And on that page, it should say, try not to be a dick. And that's all very interesting, of course. You can point out that the majority of the Bible, by the way, is not moral commands. Like, moral commands make up a dramatic minority of the Bible. Most of the Bible is like historical, so saying that the Bible should just be one thing that says try not to be a dick is a little bit weird when you're basically saying that about a book which is predominantly a historical text. So it's like, well, historical text, if the Bible should be reduced down to one thing, you would think it would be a descriptive claim, because the Bible is overwhelmingly descriptive rather than a prescriptive claim. Of course, yeah, sure, depending on your meta-ethical position and the meta-ethical position of most Christians, you might argue that prescriptive claims are in fact descriptive claims, but that's a whole other issue. The point is that, okay, ignoring all of that, if you just look at the Bible's morality, so let's just focus on the Bible's morality and ignore the fact that the Bible's morality is not actually the main focus of the Bible, I think you can actually say that in some sense, that is what the Bible's morality boils down to. Obviously in not that kind of vulgar terminology, but basically try to be a good person. And the key point is that I think the Bible overwhelmingly trusts human moral intuition. I've mentioned before Daniel Hakikachu, and by the way, actually somebody on my Gilded sent me a video of Daniel Hakikachu engaging in a debate. But Daniel Hakikachu is a radical Muslim, although I would not really say he's radical. I would just say he's theologically consistent. And one criticism he has of the Bible is he says, well, look, the Bible hardly actually has any clear moral prescriptions at all. You compare this to the Quran. The Quran has like almost a correct Islamic halal way to do everything. Like there are huge numbers of things. I mean, I've even seen, and I think this is when you're kind of getting into a lot of the, well, definitely extra Quranic, but I think really kind of out there texts, like even just like rulings of just random kind of Islamic clerics. But there arguably is like a correct Islamic way to drink water. There is certainly a correct Islamic way to go to the toilet. Muhammad actually says, and I can't be able to find the quote because that's not what really this is about, that the majority of the sins that condemn people to hell relate to how they go to the toilet. And it's things like you're supposed to wipe with, I think it's an odd number of stones. I think if I had to imagine an explanation, it would be because like, well, the odd number takes the demon away, but then if you do it again, you're, like usually with Islam, it like always comes down to like there's jinns, which is basically, actually they're genies, but they translate in kind of a Judeo-Christian sense to demons. And like that's often the explanation, like, oh, the demon does this thing, so you do this thing to get rid of the demon. I would imagine that's probably the explanation, but the point is that Daniel Hakikachu says, well, you might think that's silly that we have all these rules about how to go to the bathroom, but actually, it's good that we have all of these very, very specific explanations, because Christianity, by contrast, is almost sort of just like you're on your own. Like overwhelmingly, when you actually look at Christianity, the prescriptions aren't that clear. And like obviously there's all sorts of massive debates. Just even if you had every single thing that is kind of laid out in Christian morality, you'd still have a lot missing if you're just going by the main text. And I want to point to a passage that makes this clear, just, so I'm not just like vaguely talking around the Bible, but actually addressing it more head on. So this is from Matthew. Oh, wait, I forgot to take a note of the actual chapter. Okay, you know what? I'm going to find it actually. You know what? We're doing it live, not even cutting. Matthew 22? Yes. So this is Matthew 22:36. Somebody says, "Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law?" And he, Jesus, said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment, and a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets." Now, here's the thing. What this is saying is that it's essentially giving us a test to see whether or not something lines up with biblical morality. And that test is, well, if it doesn't line up with either of those two things, then it's not part of the law. Like, if all of the law depends on those two things, then anything which does not depend on those two things must not be part of the law. You know, if there's something else which actually, okay, it doesn't matter whether or not you love God or love your neighbor, it's something irrelevant to that, then obviously that can't be part of the law, because otherwise it wouldn't be true that all of the law depends on the truth of those commandments. So essentially what this is doing here is giving us a litmus test to see whether or not something lines up with biblical morality. And I do want to point out something obvious, which is it says, obviously, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Now, the thing about love your neighbor as yourself is any genius can, I don't know why I said any genius, it should be the opposite. Any average Joe can point out that love your neighbor as yourself is actually, in and of itself, taken literally, not a good moral system. Because obviously, what about somebody who's really masochistic? What about somebody who's feeling suicidal? There are many instances where actually treating somebody as you would like to treat. I mean, obviously, for example, based on this logic, you can argue that there's really no such thing as like sexual assault, or sexual assault is not immoral, because it would be like, well, I treated her how I wanted to be treated. You know, I wanted her to have sex with me. Obviously, that would be an example. So the point is, it's not actually a perfect, it sounds nice, but it's not a perfect system. But I think what you need to do is kind of read between the lines and recognize what this is really saying. You know, when somebody says, treat others how you want to be treated, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. I don't think you should take that literally, because taking it literally is how you end up with those weird issues. What you should really recognize is this is just saying, very simply, be good to other people. Be righteous. You know, don't hurt other people. Be kind. So the question we need to ask is, do monogamous gay relationships depend on those two commandments, or one of those two commandments? Love God with all your heart and all your soul and all of that. And love your neighbor as yourself, aka don't harm your neighbor, don't be mean to your neighbor or cruel to your neighbor. Now, somebody could argue that this falls under the category of, well, you know, if you honor God, you'll obey God's commandments, and therefore, in that sense, all of the commandments depend on honoring and loving God, because all of the commandments come from God. The issue with this is it kind of makes the entire statement from Jesus here completely meaningless. The more obvious explanation would be that actually, when it's talking about honoring God, it's talking about the things that specifically relate to God. So obviously, if you actually look at the Bible, I'm sure you know, well, the Ten Commandments, the first ones are, have no other God before God, do not have any graven images, do not blaspheme, and keep the Sabbath day holy. Those are the 4 first commandments. And you notice all of these are about honoring God. You don't harm another person by, well, you do harm 3 other people, but you don't harm another human being. Well, you harm one human being. You don't harm any mortal human beings by disobeying, by having a different God, by worshipping idols, by blaspheming God, or by not keeping the Sabbath day holy. These are not ways that you harm other people, but what you do is you harm God because you are not honoring God. And then obviously, so that you would assume is what that's covering. And then when you get into the other stuff, don't lie, don't steal, don't commit adultery, what are these all about? Not harming other people. not causing harm in the lives of other people. So it seems pretty clear that something like your relationships, whether they're gay or straight or whatever else, aren't about harming God, but rather they're about fitting in with an intuitive sense of human morality. Do they line up with our intuitive idea of human morality? So, of course, with all of this said, we need to ask the million-dollar question, is being gay wrong? And I want to start off by talking about a pastor called Steven Anderson. Now, Steven Anderson actually theologically is all right on some points, and because of that, I have actually listened to and engaged with the kind of work of Steven Anderson, because I actually think when it comes to some issues like salvation, some other things relating to eschatology and things like that, I think Steven Anderson is right. But what Steven Anderson also is incredibly homophobic. Steven Anderson actually believes that every single person who's attracted to somebody of the same sex is reprobate. And reprobate means not only, you literally can't be saved. So think about how like the kind of standard Christian homophobia is more like, well, if you're gay, you need to stop being gay so you can become saved, become a Christian, and, obviously go to heaven. But Steven Anderson's position is that if you have any gay thoughts at all, any gay desires, if you are gay, then actually you can't be saved. There is nothing you can do. Every single gay person has already rejected God so completely in their hearts that there is nothing they can do to be saved. Now, obviously, that's a pretty extreme position. He also, after the Pulse nightclub shooting, made a video saying that this was a fantastic, wonderful thing. He said, it's great there was a Pulse nightclub shooting. And he said it's a good thing because now there's, however many less... I don't know if I want to use this word because I feel like it's a controversial word. So I'm just going to say men attracted to young children. And there we go. We're just going to keep it at that. So there are far fewer men attracted to young children in the world. And actually, later on, he was on a BBC documentary or something, and he was asked, what would you say to gay people listening to you? And he said, well, I wouldn't say anything except kill yourself so that you don't molest my kids or anyone else's kids. So that's it. And I would assume, I'm taking it for granted that if you're listening to this so far, you're thinking, wow, that's pretty homophobic. But here's the thing. Steven Anderson clearly doesn't think being gay is wrong. And actually, I want to give just another quick example. I was watching this 1950s propaganda, and basically it was about people being gay. And it's like, this man has a sickness, and his sickness is that he's a homosexual. But the thing is, also that 1950s propaganda, why was it a sickness? Because I think it was the gay guy was called Ralph, and he was talking to this young boy, this underage boy called Billy. And what was the point here? Well, Ralph is a homosexual, and therefore Ralph is a threat to Billy. Billy is an underage boy, and Ralph is gonna... And again, what you would say that's homophobic, but again, what's that also kind of tacitly admitting? Well, clearly, being gay isn't wrong. It isn't bad. And if you're wondering where I'm going here, the point is, for actual bad things, we don't do that. Because you'll notice, actually, Steven Anderson, as homophobic as he is, as much as he very clearly hates, detests gay people, has not said that the act of being gay is immoral. Rather, he says gay people are immoral because they abuse kids, because they touch children, because they have that sexual attraction to children. That is Steven Anderson's position. And it is also obviously clearly the position of that 1950s propaganda. The reason why, think about it, okay, if homosexuality, if these people actually believed being gay was wrong, they could have just showed Ralph in a happy, monogamous relationship with another adult man. If being gay is actually wrong, then why couldn't you just show two happy, loving gay people in a relationship together? If being gay is wrong, why do you have to show Ralph going after an underaged boy? Because again, You don't do this with other stuff. You don't say, if somebody asks me why is murder bad, I would say, obviously, a phrase I'm fond of from Sam Harris is it's kind of hitting philosophical bedrock with the shovel of a stupid question. But the point is, I would say, well, ignoring the kind of axiomatic questions of like, well, why is, the essence of anything bad? I would just say, well, it's bad because you're taking another person's life. You're killing somebody. If somebody said, why is stealing bad? I say, well, it's bad because you're taking something that's not yours. If somebody said, why is adultery bad? I would say, well, it's bad because you're betraying somebody's trust. You're going behind their back and you're doing something which should be kind of sacred and between just two people who love each other, and you're doing it with somebody else. And that's a huge break of somebody's trust. You'll notice, here's the thing, you could accuse those explanations of being very much kind of tautological and circular. Why is murder bad? It's bad because it's murder. But the very obvious thing here, then, is that I clearly believe that murder is bad. If my explanation for why murder is bad is because it's murder, you can't deny the fact that murder's bad. Whereas here's the thing, if you ask your average homophobe, why is being gay bad? They won't say, because it's being in a loving, committed relationship with another man. No, I'm betting chances are, a lot of the time, especially the really extreme homophobic people, will say, because, I can use the British term for it actually, so I'm going to use that going forward, because they're nonces. Nonce in the UK basically means that thing, going after. Again, I don't really know. I don't know why I try to self-censor. I just am worried that the particular word, beginning with P, I just feel like YouTube probably is very, quite rightly, to be honest, concerned about that, and they might even just, flag down any... Oh, I got a fucking spider on me. That did not want to let go. I had a web on. I wouldn't mind, but it was a green one, which is I feel like... I mean, I know most poisonous spiders aren't green. Well, first of all, there aren't any poisonous spiders in the UK. But obviously, I realize maybe you might say, well, surely red is the scarier color. But I don't know, green, it's the color of venom and acid. I mean, I know most acid isn't actually green, but in cartoon logic it is. So yeah, I don't know. That's fine. I'm over it. Anyway, what was I saying? So yeah, basically, if you ask a massive homophobe, well, why is being gay bad? They're not just going to explain, well, because it's being gay. They're going to say, well, because they're nonces. Because they go after the little kids. And yeah, that's the thing. Conversely, if you ask me, why is adultery bad? I'm not like, well, because adulterers are more likely to talk during films and spoil the endings of the twist. And you're sat there and then they tell you the twist and you go, oh, why'd you do that? If somebody asks me, why is murder bad? I'm not going to be like, well, because murderers are more likely to litter. No. The reality is that things which are actually obviously intuitively bad, the explanation for why they're bad is circular, because they're obviously intuitively, axiomatically bad. It's not bad because of some other associated thing. It's bad in and of itself. And the issue is, if you're telling me that the reason being gay is bad is because they're all nonces, well, guess what? That's kind of just tacitly admitting that being gay isn't bad. And it seems to me, therefore, that the most, vehement, it's a weird word, vehement haters of homosexuals, of gay people, the people who are just most firmly against it, even they don't think that being gay is bad. And what's the point here? Well, therefore, it would seem like, is being gay against our intuitive understanding of morality? The answer seems to be unambiguously no. People don't actually think that there is any intuitive reason why being gay is bad, because if they did, then their go-to explanation for why being gay is bad wouldn't be to mention an unrelated thing. And it's worth stressing that it is unrelated, because the point is, even if there was some evidence that gay people are more likely to be nonces, which again is not an issue I'm going to get into, the fact remains that doesn't make the act of being gay immoral in itself. And yeah, like ultimately, is there any reason to condemn being gay? Well, that's actually a question. It's a kind of a question I find quite interesting, because obviously most other rules in the New Testament are intuitive. Don't murder, don't steal, all of that stuff. So I always find it interesting. What I found way more interesting, actually, is one time when I was speaking to an atheist. So I was a Christian, they were an atheist, and the atheist said they thought being gay was immoral. And I found that really fascinating. I must admit, yeah, the idea, because, as I say, even the biggest haters of homosexuals, it feels weird calling them homosexuals, biggest haters of gay people, even their biggest haters clearly don't actually think there's anything wrong with being gay, because otherwise they would bring up actual criticisms of two men being in a relationship rather than mentioning an irrelevant criticism of people being a nonce. And yeah, by the way, I'm just taking for granted, if you are a nonce, you are wrong. And I assume everyone here can agree on that. The point is, you're wrong whether you're gay or not. Nobody who is remotely healthy in the head should be saying, well, as long as, you're a nonce who's going after people of the opposite sex, it's fine. No, that's ridiculous. Anyway, I do want to look at just a few arguments I've seen for the claim that like being gay is actually wrong. So the first one, most of these come from Catholics, interestingly. Well, the first two of three is it causes men to leave their marriages. So this is a claim I've heard. The reason being gay, and that is actually a very direct thing, sure. If a gay man is married to a woman, then in order for that man to then go and actually be gay, he would have to leave his wife or cheat on her. But you'll notice this is not actually a criticism of being gay. It's actually a criticism of men being in the closet. Because if being gay was completely acceptable, you wouldn't find yourself in a situation where gay men were getting married to women in the first place. This criticism really doesn't work at all. So yeah, that's one criticism I've heard of somebody saying, well, let me explain to you, because it is an interesting question to ask people. What actual reason is there why being gay is intuitively, obviously immoral? Because again, if you're just going to say, well, it's immoral because the Bible says so, that's fine, but that is in contrast to the vast majority of other, moral commandments in the Bible, which aren't just immoral because the Bible says so. They're immoral because they're obviously immoral. Murder, theft, things like that, these are obviously immoral. Now, another Catholic one is, somebody said, well, Christ is represented by the husband and the church is represented by women. And this is actually a thing. There are, in the Bible, marriage is often presented as an analogy between the relationship of Christ and the church. And essentially what this person was saying is, well, therefore, if two gay people get married, it's like saying that, Christ can exist without the church. And it's like saying you don't need, it's like saying Christ doesn't need the church and the church doesn't need Christ. When a man and a woman get married, it's showing that Christ and the church need each other. But when a man and a man get married, that's just Christ marrying himself. And that's weird. This is weird for two reasons. The first thing I point out is it's just bizarre to take what's pretty obviously just kind of an analogy, kind of a nice way of thinking about like the, kind of force and sincerity of marriage, that just like, the relationship between Christ and the church is really serious and kind of wholesome and wonderful and full of love. So too should the relationship between a man and a woman. That would seem like just a nice message. But for somebody to then be like, and that means that we need to kind of really overanalyze it. But it was especially funny because, like I say, this was made by, this claim was made by a Catholic. And something you might know about the old Catholics is that they don't think that, like, they're very into the whole people not getting married, their priests don't get married. So surely, their priests not getting married would show that, like, they clearly don't want everyone to get married. So they're clearly pretty okay with the idea of, in this analogy, Christ existing without the church and the church existing without Christ. So it just seems like a weird point from them. And the third objection, and I do need to mention it, is what I'm going to call the poop on the penis argument. And ultimately, this seems to be like the best attempt people can make at arguing that there is some intuitive immorality to being gay. And when I say intuitive, it's worth noting. What I mean is a sense of like, in the sense that we all just know that murder is immoral. We all just know that stealing is immoral. There are many things we just know they're immoral. So the question is there any argument for how like you can say being gay is immoral and we can be like, yeah, that just makes sense? Because I haven't seen very many arguments for it at all. But the closest I think people get is like, well, reducing the entire idea of being gay down to poop on a penis. And the argument would be, well, doesn't that sound kind of gross? And obviously it's referring to the mechanics of how gay people are likely to have sex. Doesn't that sound kind of gross? But it's worth noting that this is, well, there's 3 main issues with it, I guess. Firstly, and I'll just stick to 2 main issues. The first one, and the kind of obvious one, is that gay people can admittedly have sex without that being a thing, and also straight people can have sex with that being a thing. The putting of a penis in that particular area is not necessary for gay people, and it's not exclusive to gay people. But the kind of second issue is that arguing that a particular sexual act is intuitively immoral because some aspect of it is kind of gross to think about means you have to, well, it runs into the issue that our sex drive overrides our sense of disgust. And this is actually a true fact. If I did not have a sex drive, I'm pretty sure there are many things in life I would have done, or that I have done, which I would consider so disgusting that I would not want to do them. And you might say, oh, what horrible things have I been doing? But think about this for a second. Kissing, right? Like, without a sense of any sex drive, would anybody want to just... I mean, we literally do call it swapping saliva, and that is what you're doing. The reason why I think we're able to think about it kind of with enthusiasm is because actually our sex drive is overriding that sense of disgust. And there are many examples of where like certain things that would otherwise be very off-putting to me are actually not, because my sex drive is overriding that. So considering the fact that our sexuality literally overrides our capacity for disgust most of the time, it's a bit weird to argue against the sexuality by trying to argue that some aspect of it just seems kind of gross. And yet, shockingly, as kind of dumb as this as an argument would seem, it literally is the best argument I've seen for like any sense of, oh, that's just intuitively not okay. Now, you could say that it's like objectively unhealthy, and you could say, well, if it's an unhealthy thing to do, you shouldn't be doing it. But the thing is, unhealthy things aren't really immoral. Like, I can agree that there are certainly, for lots of sex acts, there are actually health considerations. You're much more likely to get sick from kissing somebody, for example. The reality is there are obviously concerns about hygiene and cleanliness and all this sort of stuff, but that's not really a moral issue. It's just an issue of like being sensible. Now, I do need to make the obvious counterpoint, which is considering this absence of objective or intuitively obviously good reasons to reject homosexuality. There's the counterpoint, which is that homosexuality is good. And I've got 3 points I want to make here. The first one being it makes the participants happy. If you want to talk about an objective sense of things being good, of course, something isn't automatically good if it makes you happy, but if it makes somebody happy and harms nobody, and there's no sense in which you can even really conceive of it being objectionable, that would seem like a pretty good thing. Now, the second point is that gay people in a relationship also has a benefit for society because it allows for children to be adopted. There are many children who need to be adopted, and certainly if, like me, you're very suspicious of kind of reproductive sciences that would make it, possible for gay men to actually have biological children of their own, then obviously the most obvious option for them is to adopt. And to be honest, I think gay men just generally are more likely to adopt, because while for, somebody who's able to just, easily have sex, and to be honest, if you're a straight couple, you're possibly likely to have children without even trying to. Like it might happen by accident. So obviously for straight couples, the idea of going through all the work of adopting just doesn't really make much sense. Of course, sometimes it does, and sometimes I might want to do it just because we want to, do something moral for other people. But for gay men and, infertile people, but we'll talk about gay men specifically, actually going to all the effort to have their own kids with all of this reproductive science, a lot of them are probably more likely to be like, well, let's just adopt one of the kids who already exists, who doesn't have a home. And what does that mean? It means that gay kid is now going to get a much nicer life with two parents who love them. And isn't that wonderful? It would seem like this is way better for society. And it's also worth noting that, well, that's an interesting one. Something must have just fallen from my ceiling into my water bottle. I'm kind of scared to look in there. It made quite a noise. I'm going to pour that out because, I'm not going to drink from it because I have no idea what just fell. I'm always wondering if there was just because that spider was on me, I'm always wondering if some kind of bug was crawling and then just fell from the ceiling and landed. That was weird. Anyway, it's also worth noting, just the idea of having gay couples around. I think honestly, society generally, I do think singleness is something which I'm not wholly against, but I think society is often nicer when you kind of have units. Households are a bit more like units rather than just single people on their own, and that obviously would extend to families, but would also include couples. So yeah, the idea of having more families and more couples around rather than just single people who are kind of just isolated on their own, I think actually makes society just on the whole kind of better and helps build things up. The third point I want to make is that this would actually, gay relationships being valid and accepted with marriage would actually fit with Paul's original purpose for marriage. Paul's original purpose for marriage was that if you didn't get married, you would just be left to be completely a slave to your own lust, because you can't not have sex. You can if you're not into it at all. But most people have sex drives, and therefore most people want to have sex. So marriage is the way that you can have sex in a way where you are, in a way that is morally acceptable. Because the alternative is to sleep around with all sorts of people with no regard for the sacredness of that particular aspect of the human experience, and that is bad. So Paul says, well, that's why you should get married. So basically says, so we don't burn with lust, but rather we can express our lust in a healthy and good way, in a way that's honoring of God. And that is exactly, gay marriage facilitates that just as much as straight marriage. The problem is, if you're saying gay people shouldn't get married, then you're saying that gay people should burn with lust, which is the exact thing that Paul says we shouldn't do. The problem is you're literally contradicting Paul if you want to say that, oh no, actually, yeah, gay people should just be left to completely burn with lust. It's but that's what Paul said we shouldn't do. Paul said the whole reason we should have marriage is so that we don't burn with lust. So surely there needs to be some legitimate way. The implication of what Paul's saying is that anybody who has lust, there should be some way for them to express their love in a way that is pleasing and honoring for God. But if there is no way for gay people to do that, then that would seem to suggest that Paul was just lying. So I think it's pretty clear that most people don't actually even have any meaningful objection to the idea of gay people being in a relationship. Rather, they always just associate being gay with other things. And we have to consider the fact that if this is true, it's possible that the biblical authors were also like this. If people nowadays can be because there are many people who would probably say that they think that being gay is wrong. But then when you actually ask them, well, what about being gay is wrong? They would say, oh, they're nonsense or whatever else. And the point is, you'd say, well, that's not necessarily true though. It seems like they don't actually have an objection to being gay. They have an objection to some preconception they have around the idea of being gay. And if that's true for people now, why couldn't it have been true for the biblical authors? Because it's worth noting that the Bible was written by people. And while, yes, the truth of the Bible comes from God, the exact words used to communicate that don't come from God. So we don't have to say, they come from the people who wrote the Bible. So therefore, do we necessarily know that people who, condemned homosexuality in the Bible weren't speaking the truth of God with regards to, the actual associations people might make, which are based on genuine, legitimate moral objections, but inappropriately and inaccurately using the entire, just the entire concept of being gay to identify those actual more legitimate concerns. So obviously, people being predators to young boys, aka nonces, that's something which is objectionable, and like I say, I hope I don't need to explain that. But also there's promiscuity. And I want to stress this point. I think most people have an intuitive sense of promiscuity being wrong. When I first was talking about this kind of idea of Christian morality, I started off saying, you don't hurt people, and, basically using that language, you don't harm people. And then I kind of corrected myself and have kind of course corrected a bit by talking more about this idea of intuitive morality. Because the reality is that Christianity is not a utilitarian religion where the only focus is on, are you directly harming people? Rather, Christianity is a bit more of a virtue-based religion. A religion where there are certain activities which are just more virtuous than other activities. And I think that is a conception of morality which more accurately describes most people's idea of morality. And I think most people do have a sense that being promiscuous is intuitively wrong, because people have a sense, I would argue a God-given sense, that sex is a sacred thing. It's something to be done between people who love each other. It's not something to be done with no regard for anything, just completely casually with whoever you want, completely just to satisfy your own will in a completely hedonistic way. No, sex is something which you take seriously, which you only do once you've made a lifelong commitment to somebody. I think a lot of people would argue that even people who aren't religious would say that the position of you wait until marriage to have sex, you have sex with one person who you love, and that's the only person you ever have sex with, is a more moral, intuitively more moral conception of sex, an idea of, an appropriate way to treat sex, than, I just have sex with whoever I want, whenever I want, just to completely please myself. Just if somebody's going to let me bang them, I'm going to bang them. I don't care about anything else. The point is that I feel every moral critique of being gay is pretty much 100% about either being promiscuous or being a nonce. The question is, are these people who criticize being gay and say being gay is immoral, are they talking about monogamous relationships between two consenting adults? I think the whole thing relies on association, basically saying, well, being gay is bad because it reminds me of all of this other stuff. It feels like all of this other stuff. But actually, when you say, well, let's just look at the act of being gay, is that bad? Is it bad for two people who are consenting adults who love each other, who want to spend the rest of their lives together? Is them being gay bad? And I think most Christians can't give an answer to that question. Can't give an answer that's intuitive morally. And they can just say, I think really what we're talking about here is a criticism of gay culture. Saying, well, the culture of being gay is bad. Gay as a kind of social phenomenon. The idea of gay people existing in society and what that means in terms of gay clubs where, there's all sorts of hanky-panky going on and all that. But the actual act of two individual people, when you kind of ignore just viewing it as this big societal thing, instead you just say, well, what about these two individual people who aren't associated with any of the promiscuous, aren't associated with kink at pride or any of that stuff. They're just two people who want to live their lives and be perfectly, in love together in a monogamous relationship. What's wrong with that? And most Christians don't have an answer. They don't have an answer to that question. And it should bother them they don't have an answer, because not only, like I say, is the rest of the Bible very much, the rest of Christian morality very intuitive, very obvious, but also Jesus basically tells us as much by saying, look, all of these laws depend on the fact that you treat other people good, You act in a way that is intuitively moral when it comes to human morality, and then you worship and honor God. Those are the two things you do. And if you do those things, you're fine. You're golden. But therefore to be like, oh, and also there's this other thing, being in a monogamous, happy gay relationship, which does not actually contradict any human morality or anything else, but it's also just wrong for some reason. That actually doesn't really make much sense. Okay, so finally, let's get to the Bible. And I'm going to go through every single passage that really deals with homosexuality in any kind of meaningful sense. I'm not going to do it in the most detail ever, because I actually think it's kind of unnecessary. I want to stress, you might be like, why did I spend all this time not talking about the Bible? And the answer is because I think laying that foundation matters. It matters before we go into looking at the Bible that we understand what Christian morality is really about. We understand the need, if we're going to say something is immoral in Christianity, for it to be intuitively obvious but that thing is immoral. And it's worth therefore noting that no, in the case of homosexuality or being gay, it isn't. And it's also worth talking about, I think stressing that I think the majority of, kind of homophobic, non-gay affirming Christians don't even actually believe what they're saying. I don't think the majority of Christians who say that being gay is immoral even actually mean what they're saying. I think what they mean is this vague kind of like notion of the influence of gayness in society, which is to say gay culture, which is to say gay nightclubs, kink at Pride, all of that kind of stuff. They have an idea that that's immoral, but I don't think they really think that two consenting adults who love each other being in a monogamous relationship, I don't actually think they think that's immoral. Okay, now we're actually going to go through the Bible. And first thing is Genesis 19, aka the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, the thing is, pretty much everybody knows that what we're talking about here is non-consensual sex. Basically, the story goes that God sends some angels down to Sodom to check out what's what, and the men in Sodom say, oi, can we go and have sex with these angels? When the angels don't want to have sex with them. So this is, non-consensual sex, which is kind of the nonce thing. I wonder if nonce comes from non-consensual. That would be clever. Anyway, so they're being nonces, and also they're being promiscuous. So that's actually both of the things which I'm saying are actually the reasons why people condemn homosexuality are being demonstrated there. But is this any basis at all? If in Sodom there were two gay people who are in a loving, committed, monogamous relationship, they, completely consensual, they don't have anything to do with this, right? There is no condemnation of them here. The condemnation is of the men of Sodom who want to have sex with these people who don't want to have sex with them. So next you get Leviticus 18:22 and 20:13, and I'll read them both. Leviticus 22, it says, "You shall not lie with a male as with a woman, it is an abomination." And then it says, "If a man lies with a male as with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination, they shall surely be put to death, their blood is upon them." Now, point one is that the laws of Leviticus are just random laws to help distinguish surrounding tribes from Israel, or rather Israel from surrounding tribes. So this is why, this whole time I've been saying that Christian morality is intuitive. And that's because, and I've kind of also been saying biblical morality is intuitive, but that's not necessarily true depending on what you mean by biblical morality. Now, I think when you're talking about biblical morality in terms of biblical morality viewed holistically as it develops, yes, that is exclusively intuitive. Everything in there, as far as I can tell, as far as I believe, is intuitive. There's nothing that I actually believe the Bible condemns where I would then say, I don't know why they're condemning that. Every single thing, it's like, well, obviously that's condemned. But the point is that you do have the book of Leviticus. Now, Leviticus, the Levites were basically a class of priests. And what Leviticus is all about is basically just ritualistic stuff, setting Israel apart with all of these kind of arbitrary practices. So obviously, you all know you don't mix fabrics, you don't mix, you don't sow different kinds of wheat in different things. And there's all these weird rules about what animals you eat. Is there any logical reason why you can't eat camels or pigs or rabbits? Lots of people don't know, by the way, that Jews can't eat rabbits. Obviously, there's shellfish and all of that. There's all these things. Is there any reason why it's more moral to eat a fish than it is to eat a shrimp? No, that's nonsense. This isn't really about morality. What it's about is a way for Jews to distinguish themselves as the unique people chosen by God from the rest of the tribes around them. Now, that's why Jews to this day, who still believe that is the existing covenant, still engage in these practices. And to be honest, if you're a Jew, I'm not really sure, what attitudes Jews have towards homosexuality. It's all a bit confusing. But for Christians, we now believe there is a new covenant where everybody, Jew and Gentile, can enter into a covenant with God. And that means there is no need now for Christians to engage with these laws that were specifically designed to set the people of Israel apart. Because now the people of Israel aren't the chosen people of God. Sorry to break that to all the kind of like Christians who like believe in the idea that all Jews are still saved. No, the Jews aren't the chosen children of God anymore. The Jews aren't God's elect or anything like that. Indeed, any Jew now who still relates themselves to Judaism as far as religious belief is concerned is in for a big surprise in the end times. But the reality is that therefore, the Jews are no longer the chosen children of God. Instead, the chosen children of God are anybody who believes in Jesus Christ and believes in God and wants to worship and become part of God's new covenant family. And therefore, that's Chinese people, Hindus, former Hindus, it's all sorts of people. And that's why there is no need to have any kind of cultural practices for Christians to set themselves apart. And that's why the law of Leviticus no longer applies. Now, there is another point, which is that many surrounding cultures, that's the thing. So it's worth noting, even if this was saying that being gay in itself is wrong, well, that's kind of irrelevant because there's all these other random things in the book of Leviticus that are also wrong, but it's not because these things are actually immoral. It's not actually immoral to mix fabrics or anything like that. These were just random things that the Jews were supposed to do in order to distinguish themselves. And sure, if one of those things they were supposed to do to distinguish themselves was not to engage in gay sex, well, that was just a random law they had. But the thing is, it's worth noting there's actually two levels in which this particular section doesn't work, because the other issue is that many surrounding cultures had this ritualistic homosexuality in their religion. So actually, I think the literal translation of those passages where it talks about, being gay, lying with a woman, it actually is, you lie with a man in a woman's bed. And that phrase, in a woman's bed, there's an argument that what that actually means is basically in a prostitute's bed. So basically, a woman's bed is kind of like a euphemistic way of referring to engaging with and soliciting the services of a prostitute. And, obviously, in and of itself, certainly hiring a prostitute is not in keeping with Christian morality. But more specifically, this could have been ritualistic prostitution. They talk about like the cult prostitutes, which they often had in these kind of ancient Near Eastern societies. And obviously that would have been even worse. That would have been a complete no-no. Going to solicit a prostitute to have sex with as part of this like form of pagan worship of other gods, that would have been a big no-no. And this has nothing to do. Well, the point to bear in mind, first of all, is that you've got to bear in mind this is kind of the attitude that many of these cultures had when it came to homosexual relationships. It was this thing that had this kind of ritualistic significance. But it's also worth bearing in mind that if you're going by the traditional datings, then these laws come from like 3,500 years ago, which is, it has to be said, very removed from any current relationship between two gay men who are, like I say, adults in a consenting monogamous relationship. I don't think it makes sense to condemn their relationship based on a condemnation of, probably relating to the cultural attitudes of people 3,500 years ago. Now, next is Romans 1:26-27, which says, "For this reason God gave them up to dishonorable passions, for their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature, and the men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts of men and receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error. Now, here's the thing. I want to make this point. I never said, nobody has said, or no serious Christian has said that gay sex can't be immoral. Obviously, gay sex can be immoral just exactly the same as straight sex can be immoral. If sex is done just like completely with no regard at all for who you're having it with, promiscuity basically, that is entirely immoral. But the other thing is that gay sex can be immoral if the men aren't gay. If you're having gay sex and you're not gay, that's a problem, because what this is showing, and this is what I think this passage is actually criticizing, where it says God gave them up to dishonorable passions and they did all this stuff. It's talking about people who have become so obsessed with sex. They're so promiscuous. They've got no regard at all for the kind of natural, sacramental beauty of sex, that for them it's just something they do with no regard whatsoever. And it's reached a point where they don't even care who they're having sex with. Again, here's the thing. When you actually read this and it's talking about, he gave them up to these dishonorable passions and they were just banging everybody, doing all this stuff. And it's just like, it's basically describing a massive group orgy. What does this have to do with condemning? Because again, it's worth noting, and this is a really obvious point that should be stressed. Even in non-gay affirming Christianity, it's not as if every single straight relationship is therefore okay. In fact, actually, there's quite a distinct exclusivity to what straight heterosexual relationships are okay. It's just a married man and woman, a monogamous married man and woman. Anything else outside of, any extramarital sex in Christianity would be considered immoral by anybody's standards, or anybody's standards who's been paying attention. So the question here isn't like, is all gay sex okay? No, because the reality is most straight sex isn't okay. The question is monogamous sex between two gay people, just like monogamous sex between two straight people, is that okay? And talking about this passage, which is talking about people going crazy with all of this, just absolute unburdened, unbridled sexual lust and desire, well, of course, that's not okay. It wouldn't be okay if they were straight either. And by the way, and this is the key point, I suspect that most of these men who gave into this unnatural desire to just have sex with everybody probably weren't gay. Because here's the thing, Kate. I did this once. And what I mean, well, not quite. Basically, one time, I got off with, kissed is the term that you might want to use, made out with a guy. And it was so I used to drink, I used to do all sorts of things I shouldn't have done. It wasn't good. And it got to a point where I was so kind of, let's say, hedonistic, where I was basically just doing anything that was, would bring me immediate pleasure. I was drinking alcohol and just, all of this bad stuff. And I actually made out with a guy. And the thing is, did I do that because I'm gay? Well, no, the reality is I'm not gay. I'm very unambiguously not gay. This isn't like some secret, I'm actually in the closet. No, I'm just not. And actually the thing is, I having actually made out with a guy, I'm just more confident I'm not gay. But the point is, I did it not because I was gay, but because I was just so at that point where I just didn't have any respect or kind of sense of decorum around anything I was doing, that sex had just become something that was purely for pleasure, and the idea of actually even being discerning about who I was doing anything kind of sexual against wasn't really that sexual, it was just kissing, but was not even on my cards. And I actually have a similar reverse story of this, which is that I knew a lesbian once at uni who went totally off the rails. She broke up with her girlfriend and she started doing drugs, she started doing alcohol, she was doing all of this stuff, and she started having sex with men. Now, here's the thing. I don't think it would be at all reasonable for somebody to argue that therefore, she was that in some sense, her now having sex with men was a step in the right direction. No, the reality is, because she was a lesbian, but she'd gone so off the rails that she was just having sex with anyone, she was just doing anything with anyone, she'd gone completely, mental with it, And it got to a point where, again, she was no longer being discerning in terms of who she was having sexual relations with, and that extended to even going against her own sexuality. So that's just another example of this. And the final one, if you look at the proliferation of kind of futanari and sissy porn and all sorts of other pornography that kind of crosses that line into homosexuality, the guys who like this often aren't really gay. Like, I refuse to believe like the entire population of 4chan is gay, but they're really into all of this like she-male stuff, all of that. And the reason why is because they are so porn sick that they'll go for anything. And that's the reality. Like, most men who are looking at all of this like stuff that is kind of crossing that line into actual kind of homosexual pornography, they're not watching it because they're actually gay. They're watching it because they're so porn sick, they've got to a point where they're just anything that provides any sense of sexual titillation, they are no longer discerning when it comes to where that's coming from. So they're taking it all in. And this is actually a perfect example of, here's the thing, I don't believe that this Romans 1:26-27, I don't believe it has no meaning or has no purpose. It has a very clear meaning, very clear purpose. And when it's condemning these gay sex acts, it is correct, it is right, it is being accurate, because what it is condemning, if you actually look at what it's saying, he gave them up to dishonorable passion. These are about people who just completely have no regard for what they're doing anymore. It's describing a real phenomenon, and this is almost prophetic, because it's describing exactly what we're seeing now of the proliferation of internet pornography, where otherwise straight people are, doing all this stuff. And of course, if you want to talk about pornography, don't forget all of these straight women who are engaged in lesbian sex because they are performing for pornography. It's not as if every single female porn star is a lesbian. No, but they've got to a point where, again, sex has become so devoid of any kind of deep spiritual meaning, it no longer means anything. They're no longer being discerning. They have been given up to unnatural passion. Ultimately, this passage is condemning things which would rightly be described as degenerate from a Christian worldview. Promiscuity, intoxication, the deadly sins. These are things that lead people to a point where they are no longer being discerning about who they're having sex with. And once they're at that point, this would include homosexual acts. So this is not a description, this isn't just saying, well, if any person ever has sex with somebody of the same sex as them, that's bad. No, it's saying if you got to a point where you're just doing anything with anyone, no matter what, that's when you're in trouble. But here's the thing. If anything, a monogamous, imagine, a Christian person gets raised in a gay affirming household and they decide to be gay. And just as there are Christians who take seriously abstinence and waiting until marriage, this gay person also decides to say, yeah, of course, I'm in a gay affirming household. I'm going to a gay affirming church. I recognize that there is nothing wrong with being gay, but I also recognize that I need to stick to the same morality as everybody else. And that means no promiscuity, not letting my lust control me, waiting, having my life honor God and waiting until I'm married. And then they do all of that. And then they get married to another man and they, basically just have sex, which of course God created sex. There's nothing wrong with sex, when it's within a proper context. And then, obviously maybe even they adopt kids and all of that. This person is actually showing how this passage does not apply to all gay people or all forms of gay sex. It only applies to a particular, basically it's a criticism of promiscuity and what promiscuity can lead to. So ultimately, and yeah, to be honest, the only point at which that gay person who is in a kind of monogamous relationship, the only point at which they're doing anything immoral is if they get to a point where they start being so discerning with who they're having sex with that they start having sex with women, because at that point, they're no longer being discerning, they're just having sex with anybody, and that's the problem here. Now next we have 1 Corinthians 6:9-10 and 1 Timothy 1-10. Or do you not know that the unrighteous will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived, neither the sexually immoral, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor men who practice homosexuality, nor thieves, nor the greedy, nor drunkards, nor revilers, nor swindlers will inherit the kingdom of God. And then Timothy 1:10. The sexually immoral, men who practice homosexuality, enslavers, liars, perjurers, and whatever else is contrary to sound doctrine. Now, the thing about these passages is that it becomes even more ridiculous to try and apply this to contemporary modern homosexuality, because here we're talking about the Greeks, And the Greeks were a bunch of nonces. Homosexuality in Greek society was about hierarchical sexual domination. It was, and obviously that's not okay. That's not a legitimate way of engaging in sex. Ultimately, we have not really, and I will stress, okay, that part of something I looked at when I was trying to make sure I had all of the different verses, because I was pretty sure I knew all of the verses, but I wanted to make sure I wasn't missing anything. So I looked into it, and I found actually a paper that was talking about this. And I'll read the abstract to the paper and possibly link it below. It says, the author believes that these do not refer to homosexual relationships between two free, adult, and loving individuals. They describe, I don't want to say this word, but non-consensual sex or attempted non-consensual sex, cultic prostitution, male prostitution and pederasty, and the Isis cult in Rome. If the biblical authors did assume homosexuality was evil, we do not theologize off of their cultural assumptions, we theologize off of the texts we have in the canon. So the main point there is that if you want to actually look into the kind of argument for what this is actually talking about is really this kind of ritualistic kind of, really a commentary on the attitudes that the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans and generally in the kind of ancient Near East and in the ancient Mediterranean, people had towards sex, then that would be where you kind of want to look for more detail. I didn't see the point in kind of repeating all of it. And that's why I've mostly avoided talking about that issue in detail. But I think it's kind of obvious that people's attitudes towards sexuality have changed. And honestly, sexuality is a very kind of, it's a fluid thing in that the way people have thought about sexuality has changed. And that has changed in a very real sense what it means to be gay. And of course, what we've moved to now is a far more materialist understanding. Admittedly, there are people who want us to move away from this, where we understand all being gay is two biological males who are attracted to each other. That's all it is. And any of this other idea about this ritual, mystical significance to it is nonsense. But of course, that ritual, mystical significance to it has resulted in people treating homosexuality in a way where it actually has become something that should be condemned, and rightly so, because of the particular form that homosexuality was taking in that culture. And yes, homosexuality often was, and indeed in some aspects of our culture still now, is about hierarchical domination. And of course, that is completely contrary to an appropriate vision of what sex should be about. So, there are many examples of how sex has been used in history in different ways, such that you might condemn a particular manifestation of sex based on how it's being used in that culture. But that doesn't translate to in a different culture where actually, there's a much more kind of, perhaps Christian attitude that people have. You would be sure to treat things differently and recognize that distinction. And it kind of seems silly to me that people would even imagine that the Bible is describing monogamous gay relationships. I do agree that in the strictest sense, if the Bible says being gay is against sound doctrine, whatever it says, like homosexuality is contrary to sound doctrine, I can kind of see how just the immediate reading of that would be, well, obviously that's just saying that being gay is bad. But when you consider, like I say, the fact we're talking about the ancient Greeks here, the people who really had quite different ideas about sexuality, it kind of does seem ridiculous to me that anybody would think that based on this text, we can condemn the loving monogamous relationship of people in the 21st century, Western society and indeed Christians. And ultimately, of course, what really matters here, this is the key point, as far as, whether or not Christianity is gay affirming, is Christianity affirming of the relationship between gay Christians? Because if you're not Christian, this is irrelevant, right? It doesn't matter. And if you're not interested in acting out and adhering to Christian morality, this is also irrelevant. Why should it bother you what a bunch of Christians think? But if you are a gay Christian who wants to be committed to Christianity, then it does matter in that case that people would recognize that, if you're going to live out Christian morality and not be promiscuous and actually be monogamous and wait until marriage and take, the fact that sex is a kind of, marriage is a sacrament, and it's a sacrament which is the only instance where it's appropriate to have sex. If you take all of that seriously, then you're fine. And I don't see any reason why people would think, based on how the ancient Greeks treated sex 2,000 years ago, we should imagine that Paul or anybody else would object to people in a modern day with a very different understanding of what sexuality means and a much more accurate understanding of what sexuality means, why we would object to that. I do want to say a few quick things to kind of end. The first one is regarding Chris Pratt, because I've thought about this for a while, and I think I've even mentioned it before in some context. People seem to think, and something people need to realize, is that going to a gay affirming church, or indeed, a non-gay affirming church, does not necessarily speak to one's own opinion on homosexuality. I've always found it just a little bit narcissistic that people attack Chris Pratt, and it's like, look, he has so many other choices to make. Like, what about the theology? What about the services? Do people he like go there? Or basically, these are all issues. Like, what does he think about the sermon quality? There are so many issues higher on my list of priorities when it comes to what church I'm going to go to than whether or not that church affirms gay relationships. I would like it if all churches did affirm gay relationships. I don't want there to be churches that just affirm gay relationships to be politically correct and throughout the Bible, but I would like it if all churches affirm gay relationships based on a recognition that the morality of the Bible should be intuitive, and it's dishonest for people to act as if the Bible condemning homosexuality is just what the Bible says, when ultimately that's not how most people view every other instance of Christian morality. Every other thing I believe as a Christian when it comes to my morality is not something where I'm like, well, I just believe it because the Bible says it. It's something I would believe anyway because of the morality that God has implanted in me. So that's kind of my take. I don't really think that you can act as if, this condemnation or apparent condemnation of homosexuality isn't a unique thing in the Bible. Actually, I think you're being more theologically consistent if you can come up with some way of reconciling what would seem to be a intuitively fine, or morally intuitively fine form of relationship, which would of course be monogamous gay sex. So yeah, that's kind of my attitude. But yeah, I just wanted to say that because I feel like people often don't seem to understand that when I say that I would like churches to be gay affirming, that's just me saying that, but there are millions of other things I would also like churches to be, and I can't choose everything. If I started my own church, sure, I guess it would be perfect, but not everyone can start their own church. So basically, I compromise, and I don't know whether or not I'll end up going to, when I kind of settle down and really pick a proper church I'm happy with, I kind of suspect it probably won't be gay affirming because I might have other priorities, but we'll see. Anyway, that was just a point I wanted to make because I feel like a lot of people just don't seem to appreciate that, and they just assume, well, if you're gay affirming, it must mean you go to a gay affirming church, and if you're not gay affirming, it must mean that you don't go to a gay affirming church, and that's just not how it is. There are way many other priorities, which kind of proves my point that actually I think most Christians, you would never go to a murder affirming church if you thought that it was wrong. But the reality is there are many people in the UK particularly who probably do think homosexuality is a sin, and yet they don't go to churches that teach homosexuality as a sin, because there are many churches in the UK now which don't teach homosexuality as a sin, but I'd imagine there are many Christians who do believe that. So, but the point is they're kind of just okay with that, and the point is that if it was like any other sin though, they would be like, well, that's not acceptable. The point is that it's kind of I think even the people who will claim homosexuality as a sin, deep down they recognize actually if two gay people just want to be in a relationship with each other and be in a monogamous Christian relationship with each other and love each other, that shouldn't be an issue. And, when you actually look at the Bible and recognize that the Bible overwhelmingly has this focus on the, actual intuitive morality, a morality that makes sense, and then you realize that even the most strictly homophobic Christians out there can't give any real explanation for how homosexuality is wrong, and then you look at the actual text and you see, oh wait, all of this was being written at a time when homosexuality was being used for all these weird kind of ritualistic pagan prostitution things. It all kind of just adds up to, oh, I guess probably actually gay relationships are fine. And the final point I want to stress is that I am a sexual conservative. I really am. I do take the Bible very seriously, and that's why, for example, I think promiscuity is bad. The funny thing is that I feel like a lot of people watching this, probably aren't gay, and therefore actually, considering the fact that all I've said in this video is that I think being gay is fine, well, the funny thing is that, I probably haven't, actually excused many, that high of a proportion of the people watching this of any particular sin. But conversely, what I possibly have done is implicitly accused you of a sin, because I've made it very clear in this video that I think sexual promiscuity is bad. It's very bad. And therefore, the funny thing is, the takeaway here almost isn't like, well, the takeaway almost shouldn't be that I'm like saying, hey, don't worry, I'm absolving people of sin and, being super tolerant of everybody. No, actually, when it comes to the things that a lot of people are choosing to do with their bodies when it comes to sexuality, I find to be entirely objectionable. I'm really very strict about a lot of this stuff. I think that were it not for some actual kind of like technical issues with how it would work in practice, I would say that adultery should be illegal. I am against no-fault divorce laws. I think that divorce is evil. I'm not one of those people who's like, oh, your marriage didn't work out, whatever. No, I'm like one of those people who's like, hey, you made a sacred commitment before God. You don't just duck out on that like it's nothing. You need to, that's a really serious thing. And obviously I could elaborate on this. And yeah, the more I elaborated, I think just the more clear it would become that I really do take the Bible's strictures when it comes to sexuality very seriously. And on that note, I mean, it's worth noting that the Bible definitely does condemn gay subculture. If you are a gay person watching this, then actually, the takeaway is not really probably that you're not a sinner, because the chances are if you are a gay person watching this, you probably have had sex outside of marriage. You've probably done stuff that I would consider to be objectionable and stuff that would classify as a sin. But the point is that the good news is that if you're a gay person watching this, you can actually decide now to abstain from that stuff, to wait until marriage, to wait until you find somebody who you love, who you want to spend the rest of your life with, and then marry them and have sex, and that's fine. So while the focus of this video has been like, hey, this isn't a sin and it's fine, and gay affirming and all that stuff, and that's definitely true, it's also worth noting that there's still an acknowledgement that there are sins when it comes to sexuality, and most people are participating in them, and society would be a lot better if people didn't participate in that. I mean, imagine like a society where there is no more sexually transmitted diseases because everybody just waits until marriage and like extramarital sex isn't a thing. Wouldn't that be great? It's also worth noting, by the way, that, the takeaway here, I guess, isn't necessarily that all sexuality is fine, because, hey, if you're polyamorous, I'm sorry, that just doesn't work in the Bible. That's not happening. If I've got any polyamory fans watching me who want me to come out and make a video affirming polyamory, no. I am exclusively, I believe monogamy is the only acceptable thing, and that's my position. So, yeah, basically I wanted to make that point and stress that point, because I don't want to give the impression that I am anything other than a very strict conservative on this point. I really am. I really do take this seriously. I just think, like, in essence, I'm being more conservative because I'm saying, and I want to bring gay people into this kind of conservative thing too. I want gay people to only have sex within the context of marriage. And I want gay people to start nuclear families and gay people to start bringing their families to church. Yeah. If you're one of those gay people who's like, really likes the idea of going out and partying and sleeping around with whoever and, really like kink at pride and all that sort of stuff, well, maybe you should object more firmly to what I'm saying than you should object to the people who are like, I don't want gay people in my church. I want gay people out. Yeah, I know, because my attitude is, hey, gay people, come in and start conforming to my very strict idea of what it means to be, righteous when it comes to sexuality.